When we talk about Singapore's extraordinary transformation, we're not talking about a miracle. We're talking about a model of disciplined cause and effect thinking applied over decades. In the 1960s, Singapore was a small, resource-poor island with no natural wealth, no oil, and no farmland. It was surrounded by regional instability and struggling economies. Yet, within 2 generations, it became one of the richest, safest, and most efficient societies in the world. That doesn't happen by chance. It happens because a system was built, a system grounded in logic, meritocracy, and a relentless pursuit of improvement. What I want people to understand is that economic success, whether for a person, a company, or a country, follows a set of timeless and universal principles. These principles don't depend on luck, they depend on behavior, policy design, and decision-making rooted in reality, not ideology or emotion. Singapore's leadership, led by Lee Kuan Yew and his team, understood this deeply. They looked at the global landscape, not emotionally, but mechanically. They studied what worked elsewhere and engineered a system that would maximize productivity, attract talent, and enforce fairness. Let's start from the foundation, cause and effect. Every country's wealth is a result of its productivity, and productivity comes from how efficiently resources are used to create value. Singapore knew that without resources, it needed to maximize the only real capital it had, human capital. So it focused entirely on education, discipline, and skill development. They didn't try to imitate the natural resource economies around them. Instead, they built an education system that was practical, performance-based, and aligned with economic needs. Every policy was designed to raise the country's capacity to produce real value. Now, in my framework of understanding economies, I often talk about 3 key factors: culture, governance, and systems. Culture drives behavior. Governance creates rules, and systems translate decisions into results. Singapore mastered the interplay of all 3. The culture emphasized self-discipline, hard work, and respect for order, values that can't be legislated but can be cultivated. Governance was efficient, transparent, and brutally pragmatic. Policies weren't made for political popularity, they were made for long-term national survival. And systems, from taxation to housing to trade, were built to reinforce the feedback loop between performance and reward. If you think about it, Singapore's government essentially operated like a well-run business. They saw the country as a company with limited capital but unlimited potential if managed wisely. The leadership set clear goals, measured performance, and demanded accountability. Corruption was treated not just as a crime, but as a cancer that had to be eliminated for trust to survive. They paid their civil servants well, not because they wanted to spoil them, but because they understood incentives. When people are fairly rewarded for their contribution, corruption declines and efficiency rises. That's cause and effect. Singapore also embraced what many countries fear: openness to global trade and competition. Instead of protecting weak industries, it chose to attract strong ones. It opened itself to multinational corporations, provided a stable legal environment, and created incentives for innovation. This is where understanding the mechanics of global capital flows becomes crucial. Capital always moves to where it's treated best, where the rule of law is strong, where taxes are predictable, and where policies are stable. Singapore designed its system to attract global capital, not repel it. But it wasn't just about money. It was about principles. Singapore's leaders believed that moral integrity and competence had to come before popularity. They made tough calls, like maintaining strict social discipline, enforcing laws consistently, and prioritizing meritocracy over political loyalty. These aren't easy choices. They often come with resistance, But long-term prosperity rarely comes from short-term comfort. They understood that progress requires pain, the pain of reform, the discomfort of accountability, and the discipline of self-correction. Most societies avoid that pain, and that's why they stagnate. From a macroeconomic perspective, Singapore also mastered what I call the balance between debt, productivity, and stability. They avoided excessive borrowing, maintained large reserves, and built one of the most efficient public investment systems in the world through entities like Temasek and GIC. Rather than spending windfalls or printing money to stimulate artificial growth, they saved, invested, and reinvested, just like a prudent business reinvests profits into improving its systems. This long-term compounding effect, slow, steady, and intelligent, is what created sustainable wealth. Another key aspect was trust, the social contract between government and citizens. Singapore built a trust-based system where citizens believed in the competence of their government, and the government believed in the responsibility of its citizens. That mutual confidence allowed them to execute policies that other countries couldn't. For example, they implemented mandatory savings through the Central Provident Fund, a mechanism that forced citizens to save for retirement, housing, and health care. In many countries, this kind of policy would face massive backlash, but in Singapore, it worked because people trusted the system. Trust compounds faster than capital, and when it's broken, no amount of capital can fix it. What's fascinating is how Singapore used feedback loops. Feedback loops are one of the most powerful tools in any system. They allow for constant learning and adaptation. Singapore tracked outcomes meticulously. If a policy didn't produce the expected result, they adjusted it. There was no ego in their policy making, only a desire to learn from mistakes and improve. That's the mindset of an investor, an engineer, and a leader all at once. They didn't try to predict the future. They prepared for it. They didn't chase trends. They built resilience. And this is where I think the world can learn from Singapore's model. Most nations struggle not because they lack resources, but because they lack discipline and self-awareness. They ignore the feedback from their own systems, make emotionally driven decisions, and resist painful reforms. Singapore did the opposite. It confronted reality, diagnosed problems honestly, and implemented practical solutions with precision. It never allowed ideology to override logic. If you look at Singapore's per capita GDP growth over time, you'll see a consistent pattern of upward movement that correlates directly with productivity, education, and infrastructure improvements. It's a beautiful example of how cause and effect thinking translates into real world outcomes. Wealth wasn't created through speculation or luck. It was created through engineering a system that rewards competence and punishes inefficiency. So when people call Singapore's story a miracle, I think they miss the point. There's no miracle here. There's a blueprint. It's a model for how small nations, or even companies, can rise above their limitations through clarity of thought and consistency of execution. The formula is simple, but rare. Set clear principles, enforce them rigorously, measure everything, and adapt constantly. Singapore got rich because it respected reality, economic reality, human reality, and systemic reality. It didn't gamble on ideology or short-term politics. It focused on building a country like a great portfolio, diversified, resilient, and guided by timeless principles. That's not luck. That's cause and effect. When you study the rise of Singapore, you realize that its success wasn't accidental. It was engineered through a deep understanding of the three most fundamental pillars that sustain any economy: productivity, governance, and culture. These three forces work like the gears inside a well-built machine. If one fails, the whole system falters. But when they move in harmony, they compound strength over time. Singapore became a global benchmark because it understood how to synchronize those gears with precision, discipline, and integrity. Let's start with productivity because everything in economics boils down to it. Productivity is the ultimate driver of wealth. It's not about how many hours people work, but about how much value they create in each hour. Singapore recognized this early. In the 1960s, when most developing countries were chasing short-term industrialization, Singapore focused on creating an ecosystem that would sustain productivity growth for generations. They knew they couldn't compete on cheap labor or natural resources, so they chose to compete on efficiency, knowledge, and innovation. Their strategy was simple but profound: educate people, attract foreign capital, and ensure that every dollar and every worker contributed to higher value outcomes. The government invested massively in education, not as an expense, but as capital formation. They aligned schools with industries, trained teachers to global standards, and created a merit-based system where performance determined opportunity. This alignment between education and economy was critical. It produced a workforce that was disciplined, skilled, and globally competitive. Productivity, in Singapore's view, was not a statistic, it was a national culture. At the same time, Singapore never let bureaucracy choke innovation. The government acted like a venture capitalist, not a controller. They provided infrastructure, ensured political stability, and built trust, and then allowed markets to operate freely within a clear, rule-based framework. The Port of Singapore, for example, became one of the busiest in the world because of this approach. It wasn't just a port. It was a symbol of frictionless efficiency. Ships docked, unloaded, and left faster than anywhere else. That efficiency reflected the national mindset: time, like capital, must be used wisely. Now, let's move to governance, the backbone of sustainable prosperity. Governance is where most countries fail because power corrupts and short-term politics override long-term priorities. But Singapore broke that pattern. Its leaders built a governance model that was both authoritarian in discipline and democratic in accountability. They believed that leadership must be based on competence, not charisma, on results, not rhetoric. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding prime minister, famously said, "If you want to be popular, don't enter politics. Go sell ice cream." That statement reflects the essence of their governance philosophy: do what is necessary, not what is easy. Singapore's political system was engineered to minimize corruption and maximize performance. The government recruited the brightest minds, paid them competitively, and held them to the highest standards. Ministers and civil servants were expected to perform with the precision of CEOs. And if they didn't, they were replaced. There was no tolerance for mediocrity. Policies were data-driven, outcomes were measured, and feedback was constant. In Ray Dalio's terms, Singapore built a radically transparent system long before that phrase became fashionable. They didn't hide mistakes, they learned from them. Every policy was treated as a hypothesis to be tested, not a belief to be defended. The rule of law was another cornerstone. In many developing countries, laws exist on paper but not in practice. In Singapore, law was sacred, predictable, impartial, and fast. This created an environment where businesses could plan decades ahead. Investors felt secure and citizens trusted the system. Governance became a source of competitive advantage. That's rare. Most countries treat governance as an administrative necessity. Singapore treated it as a growth strategy. And underlying both productivity and governance was something even more powerful: culture. Culture is invisible, but it determines everything visible. It's the software that runs the hardware of policy and economy. Singapore cultivated a culture of discipline, responsibility, and pragmatism. From early schooling to public messaging, citizens were taught that progress required effort and freedom required responsibility. There were no illusions about entitlement. People were told that success had to be earned, not expected. That cultural honesty became the foundation of their social cohesion. Singapore's culture also combined Eastern respect for order with Western respect for merit. It created a hybrid identity, not fully Asian, not fully Western, but uniquely Singaporean. This balance gave them adaptability in a rapidly changing world. They could trade with China, partner with the U.S., and cooperate with Europe without losing their sovereignty or clarity. Cultural intelligence became their greatest asset. While other nations debated ideology, Singapore focused on practicality. The question was never, is this policy capitalist or socialist? The only question was, does it work? That mindset filtered into everyday life. Streets were clean not because of fear of fines, but because of pride. Bureaucrats worked efficiently not because they feared punishment, but because efficiency was a form of honor. When culture aligns with governance and productivity, it creates what I call a self-reinforcing system. Each component strengthens the others. Productivity drives wealth. Good governance sustains it, and culture protects it. That's the compounding effect that explains Singapore's long-term success. If you look at other nations that tried to follow Singapore's model, you'll notice something. They often copy the policies but ignore the culture. They build industrial parks, create tax incentives, and open trade zones. But corruption persists, discipline fades, and accountability disappears. That's because they miss the deeper principle. Systems work only when they're built on the right values. Singapore's success is less about infrastructure and more about mindset. It's a nation built on clear thinking, not wishful thinking. From an economic standpoint, the alignment of these three forces, productivity, governance, and culture, created resilience. Singapore could adapt to global shocks because its internal systems were coherent. During the Asian financial crisis of 1997, when many regional economies collapsed under speculative attacks, Singapore stayed stable. Why? Because its governance maintained trust, its productivity kept the economy efficient, and its culture remained disciplined. The system was built for uncertainty. When you zoom out, Singapore becomes a case study in systems design, the art of creating virtuous cycles instead of vicious ones. Good governance created trust, which attracted investment, which increased productivity, which reinforced national pride and discipline, which in turn strengthened governance. That's a positive feedback loop, the same kind of loop that drives successful organizations, investors, and families. It's mechanical, predictable, and scalable if understood correctly. The lesson here isn't just for governments. It's for anyone who wants to achieve lasting success. The same principles apply to personal wealth, corporate management, or national policy. Productivity without governance leads to chaos. Governance without culture leads to rigidity. Culture without productivity leads to stagnation. You need all three working in balance, monitored by data, adjusted by feedback, and guided by principles. So when people ask, how did Singapore get so rich? The answer isn't just economics. It's systems thinking. It's the conscious engineering of productivity, governance, and culture to produce compounding prosperity. They built an environment where doing the right thing wasn't exceptional. It was normal. And that normalization of excellence is what separates Singapore from the rest of the world. In economics and history, one pattern always repeats itself. Wealth and power move toward those who manage their systems well. Whether it's a family, a company, or a country, The principle is universal. Those who understand how systems work, how people, capital, and productivity interact gain strength. Those who mismanage or ignore those mechanics lose it. Singapore became one of the most successful nations in modern history because it mastered the art of system management. It created a structure that rewards efficiency, enforces transparency, and aligns incentives across every layer of society. If you think about it, most nations fail not because they lack intelligence or resources, but because they fail to manage themselves, they fail to align their goals, measure outcomes, and make hard adjustments when the system starts to break down. Singapore avoided this trap by constantly maintaining its system like a finely tuned engine. Every policy, every law, every institution was designed with a clear understanding of cause and effect, how one decision would ripple through the entire economy and society. That clarity of thought is what separates the countries that rise from those that fall. Let's take governance as an example of system management. In Singapore, governance isn't about ideology. It's about engineering. The government functions like a well-run corporation with clear goals, performance metrics, and accountability. Ministers are treated like executives responsible for measurable outcomes. If a policy isn't producing the intended results, it's reviewed, restructured, or replaced. There's no room for wishful thinking. That approach might sound cold or mechanical, but it's what keeps the system healthy. It's like a doctor monitoring the vital signs of a patient and making continuous adjustments to maintain stability and growth. This systemic efficiency extends to how Singapore manages capital. In the global economy, capital is like water. It flows toward the most efficient and predictable environments. Investors, companies, and entrepreneurs are drawn to places where their efforts are rewarded fairly and the rules don't change overnight. Singapore understood this dynamic early on. It built one of the most transparent, predictable, and business-friendly environments in the world. Taxes are competitive, contracts are respected, and corruption is virtually non-existent. That combination made Singapore a magnet for global capital, not because it offered the highest short-term returns, but because it offered long-term certainty. This is where understanding systems thinking becomes critical. Systems thinking means understanding that everything is connected, that every policy affects multiple layers of society and economy. When a country changes its tax laws, for example, it affects business confidence, employment, consumer spending, and foreign investment. In most nations, these relationships are ignored or misunderstood, leading to instability. Singapore's leadership, however, treated the economy as an interconnected machine. They made decisions with precision, balancing trade-offs between growth, equity, and stability. That's why their system didn't just create wealth, it sustained it. Transparency played a huge role in this. Transparency builds trust, and trust builds stability. In a system where people can see how decisions are made, they're more likely to cooperate. In Singapore, transparency wasn't just a slogan, it was institutionalized. Government budgets, corporate regulations, and public initiatives were all conducted under clear rules. When investors looked at Singapore, they didn't see uncertainty or political chaos. They saw predictability. That's what made them invest. It's the same principle that